August 1944. Deep inside liberated France, a magnificent French chateau had been turned into an Allied rear-area hospital, far away from the gunfire and destruction of the front lines. Warm sunlight slipped through rows of carefully trimmed trees and spread across the clean gravel pathways surrounding the estate. Orderlies and nurses walked calmly between the buildings with slow practiced movements, almost as if the war did not exist beyond the walls of the property. Inside the massive chateau, polished mahogany furniture gleamed under soft lights, while expensive French wine rested inside crystal bottles on decorated tables. The air smelled of wealth, comfort, and safety. It felt more like a luxurious country resort than a military hospital in the middle of World War II. Yet only a few miles away, American infantrymen were crawling through mud-filled hedgerows under artillery fire, bleeding to death while desperately waiting for medical help that never arrived in time. The peaceful atmosphere shattered the moment a convoy of dirty olive-drab transport trucks rolled through the iron gates carrying urgent orders directly from the front. The exhausted drivers stepped out covered in dust and sweat after traveling non-stop from the combat zone. They carried an emergency request from overwhelmed field hospitals, begging for a detachment of highly trained American surgical nurses to be sent immediately toward the frontline triage tents. Casualties were arriving faster than surgeons could handle them. Men with shattered bones, severed arteries, and deep shrapnel wounds were dying before treatment could begin. Every extra pair of trained hands mattered now. But inside the administrative office of the Grand Chateau, the entire mission came to a sudden stop. A stubborn senior administrator calmly refused to release the nurses. The request was buried under military bureaucracy, while wounded infantrymen continued dying only miles away. News of this refusal would soon travel up the chain of command until it finally reached General George S. Patton himself. The conflict inside the chateau quickly became more than a disagreement over paperwork. It became a direct clash between the brutal reality of frontline combat and the comfortable isolation of rear-area command. One person who understood that reality better than anyone was Lieutenant Margaret Carter, a 29-year-old surgical nurse from West Texas, serving with the 10th Medical Battalion. Before the war, she had worked inside a struggling rural clinic where she learned to treat terrible injuries using very little equipment or medicine. Years of handling emergency trauma cases had hardened her nerves and sharpened her medical instincts. When she joined the Army, she believed her skills would help save ordinary American boys thrown into the violence of global war. Since arriving in Europe, she had already witnessed the nightmare of the beachhead landings, where terrified teenage soldiers screamed in pain, while medics fought desperately to keep them alive on blood-soaked sand. Those memories never left Margaret Carter. She could still remember wiping sweat from the faces of dying soldiers while explosions shook the ground around them. The smell of blood, smoke, burned metal, and infection had permanently settled into her mind. That was why the situation inside the chateau filled her with growing anger every single day. Instead of treating badly wounded infantrymen near the front lines, she watched elite surgical nurses waste their skills performing small domestic tasks for healthy officers, living comfortably behind the fighting. Men trained to stop catastrophic bleeding and perform life-saving emergency surgery were changing bedsheets, carrying food trays, and maintaining luxury rooms for senior administrators. Margaret believed it was disgusting. Every morning she pushed for orders to move closer to the battlefield where real casualties desperately needed experienced medical teams. But every request was delayed, ignored, or rejected by the command structure, protecting the comfortable sanctuary. The man standing at the center of the problem was Colonel Horace Bingham, a 50-year-old medical corps administrator from a wealthy Connecticut family. Unlike the exhausted field medics working near combat zones, Bingham viewed the war from the safety of polished offices and organized paperwork. To him, the conflict was not a human tragedy, but a carefully managed system designed to preserve order, prestige, and military authority. He often repeated to his staff that the comfort of high command officers had to be protected at all times, because proper military image was essential during wartime. Inside the requisitioned French chateau, Bingham enjoyed a level of luxury almost untouched by the hardships surrounding the rest of Europe. He wore perfectly tailored uniforms, drank expensive French wine from crystal glasses, and sat behind an enormous mahogany desk, while front-line soldiers fought and died far away from his peaceful surroundings. By late August 1944, the Allied breakthrough across France had accelerated at a dangerous speed. After escaping the deadly Normandy hedgerows, Patton's Third Army was advancing rapidly toward the German border. But the fast-moving offensive created enormous logistical pressure across the entire front. Supply lines stretched across hundreds of miles of liberated territory, while fuel and ammunition shortages constantly threatened the advance. At the same time, frontline hospitals became flooded with wounded infantrymen arriving directly from brutal combat zones, where artillery shells, mortar fire, machine guns, and hidden mines tore through advancing units every day. Surgeons worked around the clock in overcrowded field tents trying to save lives with limited equipment and exhausted medical teams. Meanwhile, many rear area headquarters remained protected from these realities. Comfortable administrators living safely behind the front lines slowly became disconnected from the suffering happening only miles away. One afternoon, the growing crisis finally reached a breaking point. A dust-covered field captain stepped through the heavy double doors of the chateau carrying signed transfer papers in his hand. He approached Colonel Bingham's massive mahogany desk, while the administrator calmly sat drinking red wine inside his private office. The captain explained that frontline hospitals near the hedgerows were overwhelmed with casualties and urgently required the surgical nursing detachment stationed at the chateau. But Bingham barely reacted. Without even showing concern, he stated that he had no intention of releasing the nurses. The captain pointed directly at the official signatures authorizing the transfer, and reminded him that emergency wartime regulations allowed combat commanders to draw rear area medical personnel during active operations. Still, the administrator refused. Then he openly declared that maintaining comfort and prestige for visiting generals mattered more than sending elite nurses into what he called a chaotic wilderness, filled with replaceable infantrymen. The field captain immediately realized that no amount of paperwork or military regulation would ever change the administrator's mind. Without another argument, he folded the rejected transfer papers, placed them back into his pocket, and quietly walked out of the office. Moments later, he radioed the full situation up the chain of command. The report reached General George S. Patton within the hour. Soon afterward, Patton's jeep arrived at the gates of the chateau, completely without warning. 4 stars gleamed brightly on his helmet, while ivory-handled revolvers rested heavily against his belt. The general marched through the luxurious hallways, ignoring every decoration around him as stunned staff members froze in silence. His boots struck sharply against the marble floor, while soldiers snapped into rigid salutes. Then, Patton reached the office doors and violently kicked them open with a crash that echoed across the entire building. Colonel Bingham jumped from his leather chair in shock as Patton entered the office. The administrator nervously tried welcoming the general, but Patton ignored the greeting completely. Standing motionless across the room, he asked a single cold question. Why were the transport trucks outside still empty while wounded infantrymen waited for medical help at the front? Bingham swallowed hard before repeating that the nurses were needed to maintain high standards for visiting officers and preserve military prestige within the chateau. Patton's face remained expressionless. In a quiet voice that carried across the room, he explained that a wartime hospital had only one purpose: repairing the men fighting and dying on the battlefield. Then he accused the administrator of hiding behind luxury, while young American soldiers bled to death in dark hedgerows, only 20 miles away. Finally, Patton gave him exactly 10 seconds to release the nurses, or personally face the consequences of his actions. The administrator broke immediately. His face turned pale as he reached for the telephone and signed the release orders for the surgical detachment. Within minutes, military police arrived at the chateau, while the nurses calmly boarded the waiting transport trucks, carrying their medical equipment toward the front lines at last. But Patton's punishment was not finished. In front of the silent staff, Colonel Bingham was ordered to remove his clean administrative jacket and exchange it for dirty field fatigues stained with grease and mud. Then he was marched directly into a utility jeep bound for the combat perimeter. By nightfall, the former administrator stood inside a crowded frontline triage tent, surrounded by blood-soaked bandages, shattered bones, screaming casualties, and exhausted surgeons struggling to keep dying soldiers alive. For the first time in the war, he faced the brutal reality he had spent months ignoring from behind polished walls and crystal glasses.